Edward, you were Balliol trained and went on to become a chemist, indeed an academic chemist. But your later years have been spent writing and publishing on Jewish history. And we're here today to talk about your latest book, which has been published by I.B. Torres recently under the Radcliffe Press imprint, The Jewish Journey. And that you think shows a new slant on Ashkenazi Jewish history and also on European history.
Yes, Drummond. I think that I've brought a new kind of interdisciplinary approach to the subject, in the sense that historians have in the past taken some notice of genealogy when it suited their narrative. But of course the recent developments of genetic genealogy and DNA tests have transformed the picture in the sense that they emphasize different aspects of European Jewish history. My work started as another attempt to find out about my ancient family background. But as the work progressed and I found more and more connections between ancient Jewish families, what emerged was that they became in microcosm a picture of Ashkenazi Jewry in general. And DNA tests have reached a stage when they make a valuable contribution to genealogy, to supporting or confirming or disproving family connections. But they've also been developed to give a rough idea of genetic admixtures by comparing autosomal DNA test results with those of other Jewish probands and also with non-Jews of known pedigree. So by combining European history with Jewish genealogy and DNA tests, we get a completely new side of European history, which is not, as it is traditionally, the political and cultural interactions of various ethnic groups, but also their genetic admixtures and how they change in the course of the major migrations that have been characteristic of European history for a very long time.
So you think that the book then says something more about European history than just talking about the Jewish diaspora?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I should say that Jewish history is an integral part of European history, in the sense that the Jews have been everywhere in Europe, and going back 2,000 or 3,000 years, there were Jews in Italy, Spain, in the Rhineland. So we go back a long way, and the interaction between the Jews and their host people and all the people they met in the course of their millennial journey have influenced both the Jews themselves and European history as a whole. The people they met, of course, we know that they were around in Greek and Roman times, and subsequently we met Celts, Franks, other Norsemen, Vikings, Normans.
My lord.
Yes, absolutely. Going on further to the Moors who invaded Spain, and the Ottoman Turks who came deeply into Europe before they were turned back as late as the 17th century. And Slavs, various Slav peoples. So all these interactions have not only had effects on European culture as a whole, but also had an impact on genetic admixtures. And only because of the recent advances in genetic genealogy and anthropology can we now trace the course of these interactions and relate them to what we know about the history of migrations across the continent. In other words, to put it in a nutshell, I believe that Jewish history in Europe is an integral part of the history of the whole continent.
Several places recur in your book, and I was not always the places that one might initially imagine. And I was wondering, how important is that concentration on different places to Jewish history, or is that a bit misleading maybe?
That's a very interesting question, because Jews settled initially in the places that were geographically inviting or favorable. So in other words, they would have come into Europe when they came voluntarily. Of course, in Roman times they would have come involuntarily, but up the river valleys and in coastal areas, and of course as time went by, their communities grew when they were favorably situated, and if the general political and social background was congenial. And of course, as we know, as time went by, political changes and invasions and wars, etc., had a negative impact, and sometimes they were expelled, and sometimes they were forced into ghettos, and so communities grew and declined as European history unfolded. And so whereas some of these communities have lasted and grown and are still there after 1,000 or 2,000 years, others have declined, and nevertheless one can say that the Jews at one time or another got to the furthest corners of the European continent. So as for the really major centers, they are well known. I mean, 2,000 years in Italy have left important communities that have grown over very long periods of time, such as Bologna, Padua, Venice, Rome, of course, and other towns only came to the fore at a much later date, such as, for example, Livorno, which was quite a very important Jewish community in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, or Trieste, again in Spain. They were in Visigothic Spain in early days, and in Girona, Barcelona, Saragossa, and so on, and also in the Moorish part of Spain, and they lived very well and happily and successfully in both the Christian and Moorish parts of Spain for hundreds of years, until the time of the Spanish Inquisition, which of course, as you know, was a major break in Jewish history and led to some conversions of the Jews who stayed, and which introduced a genetic admixture into the Spanish and Portuguese population. To this day, they say that 20% of their upper classes have Jewish admixture. And of course, while some Jews stayed and converted, the majority left Spain and Portugal, and they went to the Low Countries, where Antwerp and Amsterdam rose, and Amsterdam in fact became the most important and largest Jewish community in Europe. And in the same way as they went to the Low Countries, and ultimately from the Low Countries to England, so they also went to the Ottoman Empire, which at that time welcomed them, because they very much appreciated what the Jews had done for the economy of Spain, and what they would do for the Ottomans, which they duly did for some time. So they were reasonably quite well off there, and towns like Salonika started to grow at that time with Sephardic Jews who fled from Spain. And so we mustn't forget the Ashkenazi are called Ashkenazi after Germany. They were in Germany for 2,500 years or more, and the ancient communities like Frankfurt, Worms, Speyer, Mainz, Mayence, Heilbronn, Trier, and so on. Older vintage than even in southwestern France, in Provence, which also had ancient Jewish communities like Narbonne and Arles, Nîmes, and so on. And then, of course, expulsions and persecutions at the time of the Crusades and after the Spanish Inquisition and so on forced more and more Jews to go eastwards to Poland and Lithuania and so on, and they grew, and of course they prospered for a time, and until later, of course, again events brought a change in circumstances. But there you have very large Jewish communities, which incidentally included like Krakow, Lublin, Grodno, Brest-Litovsk, Vilna, and so on. And then Galicia, which was part of Poland but became Austrian, the little town where my paternal ancestors came from. When I say came from, I mean for the last 200 or 300 years, they were in a town called Brody, which is now a fairly insignificant town in the Ukraine, but which was for 100 or 200 years most important trading center, and grew to be the second largest Jewish community in Europe after Amsterdam. And so it goes on. So there are hundreds and hundreds of Jewish communities, some large, some have maintained their importance. And of course, as Brody deteriorated, as economic circumstances changed in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the Berlin and Vienna and other major cities, Warsaw is another example, they grew in importance and dwarfed the communities that had been prominent in earlier times. So that is a, sort of just a tour d'horizon of the rise and fall of Jewish communities. It just illustrates again the pan-European nature of the Jewish presence in Europe.
Yes, it does. I mean, I hadn't really realised the force of that until I read your book. And I didn't realise until very recently, of course, that Joseph Roth, the novelist, was born in Brody.
Oh, many people were born in Brody. Many famous people.
One that crossed my path.
Absolutely true. Yes, that's true.
You contrast endogamous and exogamous periods in Jewish history in the book, and I was just wondering what drove these, as it were, what drove the shifts, and what effect the shifts from one kind of marriage to another actually caused. You know, how did that impact?
I know it's again a very complex picture, because things were simpler in the first millennium of our era, when Jews and Christians in the Empire of Charlemagne or earlier lived fairly happily together and intermarried, at least in the upper classes. Religious antagonism was more directed against the heretics than the Jews. And the Jews got on very well, for example, with the Visigoths, because the Visigoths are not regarded as proper Christians, in inverted commas, because they were of the Aryan. They were, in fact, called Jews
seen as heretics by
the Catholics. But that all changed at the time of the Crusades, because although they were initially directed against the Muslims primarily, they also led to religious fanaticism and persecution of the Jews, and that in one form or another lasted for hundreds of years, as you know, and took many forms. It led to expulsions from individual towns and from whole countries for some time, and sometimes, more often than not, they were readmitted at eventually at different intervals. And it also led to endogamous communities. They were forced in Italy and other countries, they were forced into ghettos. And but in spite of all that, cultural interactions between the Jews and the host, the other peoples, continued in one form or another. Of course, the other aspect of this is that because of this religious persecution and antagonism, Jews were excluded for a very, very long time from most occupations. They were forced into money lending, which was held against them later, but they were actually encouraged to do it, because in earlier days, when in the age of faith, as you might say, money lending was forbidden to Christians. It was called usury, as you know, and so the Jews were forced to do it. They did it quite successfully, but they were then regarded as then became scapegoats, because the antagonism, the peasants and the people who had need for money lending blamed it on religion, whereas in fact a lot of religious persecution, so-called religious persecution over many hundreds of years, had a basic economic cause. Even some of the major expulsions arose from the desire to expropriate Jewish property and so on. So that is a sad aspect of European history, but it is more than made up for by very lengthy and glorious chapters of cooperation and peaceful coexistence and intermarriage, which happens in early days in Spain and in parts of even in Italy, say in Ferrara and Modena. The Destis were very Philo-Semitic and so on, and of course Casimir the Great of Poland invited the Jews who were forced out of Germany to come and gave them economic and political privileges and so on. And so it is a complex picture, but in the end we reached the age of enlightenment and emancipation in the 18th century, when society was thrown open to Jews, to all the professions and all their full cultural life. And so the Jewish contribution to European history in general took a wider turn. So that's very roughly the picture there.
You spoke about using DNA and the interdisciplinary approach that you've taken. I mean, other pitfalls in using DNA in the kind of way that you've used in the book?
Yes.
I mean, you have to avoid certain.
I know what you mean. I mean, there's quite a lot of misconception abroad about what DNA can do and whether it's reliable and what it can contribute to genealogical and historical research. There's no doubt in my mind that this is the area for spectacular future advances in not only in genealogy but in historical research, because as I said earlier, history has concentrated in the past, but not only of Jews, history in general, it's concentrated in the past on political, social and cultural changes and so on. Whereas the genetic admixtures inevitably consequent to not only to Jewish migrations, but to the very major migrations which have come across the European continent from Asia and Africa and also within Europe, have formed a Europe which is still divided into political entities, although we are trying, some of us at least are trying to desperately to
some of us are.
Bring it together, but it becomes a fascinating aspect of and part of European history to trace these genetic admixtures against the known history of the migrations. Now, as far as Jewish genetic history is concerned, that is making enormous strides. One might say that the Jews are making a better start at this than non-Jews because of the Holocaust and the loss of so many records, that all the younger Jewish generations that are growing up, who are very keen in this day and age to find their roots, have great difficulty in doing so by traditional methods. And there are now tens of thousands of them who have done and are queuing up to take DNA tests, some of whom understand the ins and outs, and others think that the DNA test will provide a simple answer and tell them who their ancestors are, which of course they cannot do. So failed expectations may explain for some of the skepticism that is about as far as DNA is concerned. But in actual fact, I find that with about 100 what I call probans, people whom I've studied in a circle of my ancient Jewish families, we find that these commercial DNA tests throw up literally thousands of so-called DNA cousins. We find I have several thousand people who share quite a lot of DNA with me, who it would be difficult to follow up by traditional methods. Now, I find that even with very well-connected non-Jews who have famous ancient pedigrees, this is not so easy, for the simple fact that since they are lucky enough to know a little bit more about their pedigrees than the general run of Jewish youngsters, they have not bothered to take DNA tests. So advances in DNA are to some extent dependent not only on the refinement of the tests to find newer and ways of interpreting the DNA of different kinds. The numbers of people in these data banks is crucial, as well as the refinement of their policies.
Yes, no, I can see that to get a statistically significant connection. You were saying that this book started from your family history, but then sort of expanded enormously, and clearly it has a huge scope. But what does the personal history mean to you here in London in the 21st century?
Well, I would say, obviously, it means a great deal to me because I've spent 15 years in my researches, which, as I said previously, started out simply as an attempt to find my own family roots. I might interpolate here that my parents didn't tell me very much. They were not particularly interested. They knew where they came from, but didn't think that I would benefit from any deeper researches into this field. But times have changed, and so as far as I'm concerned, I was brought up in a fairly assimilated atmosphere. My father should have followed generations of his forebears as a rabbi, but in the time of his youth, the Enlightenment and Emancipation had taken a firm hold, and all the young Jews wanted a secular education, so he ran away and worked his way through college, as they say, and studied economics under a famous Professor Joseph Schumpeter, who became as you know, world famous in the later days, but he was at that time still professor in a little eastern town called Czernowitz in Austria, and then he went to the University of Vienna to study law, and my uncles and aunts became lawyers, which is an interesting reflection on their rabbinic ancestry, because rabbis were not only spiritual leaders but also and political leaders to some extent, but were also very much concerned with Jewish ethics. And coming to the Jewish contribution to European history, I would say the Bible and Jewish ethics are the most important contribution the Jews have made to European civilization, in my opinion. There are others, but this is the one that immediately comes to mind. So anyway, coming now to what happened to me after my childhood days, I came to England. I absorbed English culture. I then went to Oxford, as you know, and I spent in total 8 years in Oxford, 6 of them, I'm happy to say, at Balliol. I would say that what has emerged in recent decades is a better understanding of who we really are, in the sense that for a long time people argued about nature versus nurture. We realize now more clearly than we have in the past that we are all a mixture of genetic inheritance and interacting with our environment and our nurture in a complicated way. Now, as I've mentioned, my childhood environment was a typical mid-European environment, which I emphasize had strong roots in the legacy of Israel, Greece and Rome, and that's the way I was brought up. And European culture influenced me side by side with the Jewish tradition of my ancestors. Then, when we came to England, I rapidly absorbed English contemporary culture. To some extent, I must give credit to my parents for immediately sending me to a boarding school as soon as we got here, and I was thrown into an environment where no one spoke a word of German, so I was forced to learn English very rapidly indeed, and one of my main guides, you may be amused to hear, was a complete edition of the Illustrated London News, which gave me a very good background of social history over a certain period. But anyway, so then I went to school in Oxford and spent 6 years at Balliol, and so I would say that combining the genetic heritage that I had struggled to establish through my researches, I feel very conscious of my childhood environment and the influence of my nurture, and particularly the nurture of my alma mater.
Thank you very much. I hope the book's a great success. It certainly deserves to be. I found it really extremely interesting. Thanks.
Thank you very much for taking an interest and for coming to talk to me today. I appreciate it.